And I really thank the Lord for bringing me here, but bringing her here.
Mm-hmm. I thank the Lord that He brought her here too.
Amen.
I couldn't, as a parent, ask for a better environment where I can go home and not worry what's happening or about her safety. And so I really think Anderson University is a blessing. And I got to stop because I will cry. I'm the transition coordinator for Florence School District 1. And that involves planning, helping people plan. I actually train teachers on transition IEPs and monitor what they're doing in the services they are. I have 2 assistants in my office, and out of my office we actually do some job community-based training. Some of it's job training, some of it's community-based instruction. They take groups out and set up job sites for mainly the students with autism that are in the self-contained programs in the high schools and the intellectually disabled moderate level students. But then on our Career Center campus, I have a community-based training coordinator who works with me to do those students that might not be getting state high school diplomas, and she does all their community-based job site training because we actually have some teachers, special ed teachers out on the Career Center campus teaching those students that aren't getting state high school diplomas. Like we have a community-based training class, an employability transition class for seniors. We have some community living, life skills kind of classes, and we have an intro to computers class so that they can possibly, after they get through with that, the students can then take the regular computer classes at high schools. But they're bussed in through from every high school, just like all the other kids that come to the vocational or career center for welding or whatever. They ride those buses and they come, and we require them to have so many hours of that. Now, the state of South Carolina has finally adopted a credential for that type of student, and they're more the intellectually disabled mild. Every now and then we might have somebody with other health impairment that is severe enough that it's affecting their academics and they're just not being successful. We also have some students with some learning disabilities, but the program was actually designed for that student that's in the mild range, in the intellectual disability mild range. And it's kind of transferred over the years because the state of South Carolina had overrepresentation of that population for some students, and so therefore, when they redid a lot of testing, miraculously somehow, we were talking about that this morning, those students became students with learning disabilities, but I think they really some of them fell within that slow learner range, which is the 70 to 80 kind of mark on the IQ scale. And when they fell in that range, they would have been thrown to the wolves. But yet they've been in some self-contained classes, and some of them were high school students. And so we, with all good conscience, could not just shove them out into all general education with no kind of support. Even though the papers said all that and the testing said all that, we just couldn't do that. So creatively, I guess, I don't know what happened in all those meetings. But anyway, we still have some of those students, even though they may not be intellectually disabled mild, we still have some that are higher functioning. And you'll see when you get to be in your classes, I told Adriana this morning, I said, the one thing, when you start as a new teacher, the first week or two, you're there. And before the kids get there, and it seems like, we have 4 or 5 days before our students start. Well, don't be make sure that you already have what you, in your mind, what you're going to start with on the first day, and you kind of already have it planned, because you'll get there and the district will have everything planned for you. And you'll get little time in your classroom.
Yeah.
And you get overwhelmed.
I always had to start like at least 2 weeks before
Right.
I had to be there just to get everything kind of
Yeah.
ready.
Well, then that takes a little bit of pressure off. You know what you're, they'll go through schedules and bells and who's doing bus duty, and then you'll have to go here or there possibly for a special education department, a whole district department meeting or a school meeting, and
And they have parent open house.
they do right off the bat.
Right off the bat. So you got to have your room ready.
Because those parents are like itching to get in there.
Yeah.
And the kids
Like,
get so excited.
Yeah.
And they want to see their teacher in the room.
Right. Just don't let it frustrate you. If you kind of plan ahead of time and know, I think the main thing I've always seen with our new special ed teachers is so much information at one time in such a short period of time. You kind of get it all mixed up and you don't know which way to go. Whatever you do, just always remember, just like you probably tell your students, there is not a question that is a dumb question. Always ask them. If you're not clear on where you're supposed to be or what you're supposed to be doing, ask somebody. That's probably I found a lot of people will go a whole year and we've not maybe heard from them because there's a group of us, and I have 6 schools plus a few elementary schools that I talk to the teachers, quite frequently, but we have a total of 20-something schools. So it just can get to where we've got 200 and something teachers to deal with. And so if you kind of don't raise your hand and say, sometimes you might get frustrated. Don't let yourself get to that point without raising your hand and getting hold of somebody. Because it's just overwhelming that first year. Actually, I've told people if you can make it through the first couple of years are the toughest to me. And then you kind of get in a routine and you get used to it. Because it's still all new. It was just like when you were a freshman. And then sophomore year, I don't know how many of y'all had it, but typically you have sophomore blues where you're ready to go. You think, oh, I can't do this. I'm going home. I can't do this. I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. Well, no, I did it too. I can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And then you get to your junior year, and it just flies by, and your senior year really flies by.
Oh, gosh. Junior year kicked my butt, though. I remember I was like, I think I had the junior blues.
So just make sure. I have when you look at your little PowerPoint, we are not going over 52 slides today, but there was information in there that I wanted you to have. And so I'm going to use this as an example. If you look at every piece of that bark right there, are any of them alike? And they all have different ingredients on top. Okay, think of that, compare that to transition planning. Transitions planning for life after school for these kids. In South Carolina, it's 13 and older. If they turn 13 within the life of the IP, then it starts.
That's how mine was.
Just in South Carolina. Yeah. Now in North Carolina, I don't know if they have. What happens is the federal law actually says 16, and it used to say 16 and 14.
Right.
If the team felt like it was necessary. But now it says 16 and younger if the team feels like it's necessary. And so transition's just planning for life after school. And it's hard to get these kids to think like that because they're thinking, I am not going to school after I leave this K through 12. I am not going. I'm not going anywhere else. I'm just going to go home and I might get a job or I might just chill for a little while. Or So you have to get these students learning how to plan, learning how to think about their goals and setting goals. And we're going to kind of cover some of that today. I did stick in there on the State Department website under instruction and special services. They have lots of good resources, and we'll go to it in a few minutes. But this is kind of the overall big picture of transition planning. And y'all know, y'all are all familiar already with IDEA, right? Okay. and the reauthorization. In South Carolina, what you have to do is, because South Carolina is 13 and the federal law is 16, you have to take the most stringent of the two. So therefore it's 13. And if they don't turn 13 to the last day of school that year, or to the last day of that IEP, you have to address it. And so that's something you kind of, especially if you're going to be in secondary ed, you have to look. The first thing I would do would be make sure I had an IEP on every kid. Check all their dates of birth, because every district's different. Some districts do all their annual review meetings in the spring, and some do it by birthdays, some do it by other dates.
Can we talk about that for just a minute?
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain to us how a district does it when they do it by birthdays if they're setting annual goals?
Yes.
Because that's
Well, we just started that this year.
Look, I understand the rationale behind it because it's easier to have them scattered across the year than all at
Right.
one time.
And so you're doing it from October to October. Okay. So you actually work on, say, it was today. Then you had till a year from today, or 300, that actually it's going to make you have a meeting prior to that. Our program will automatically calculate those dates to 364 days later. So you have to have it on or before that IEP runs out. And you write goals based on skill-based, based on your weaknesses. Your weaknesses drive your annual goals. And when they become transition, then they also have the transition assessments you've done, and it's skill-driven too. So,
quick question
Mhm.
about writing goals and stuff. I've been to like an IEP meeting, we've done them in here, but when we do them in here, we typically like pick a few skills or weaknesses or whatever. When you do it, do you like have to list every single strength you can think of and every single weakness you can think of, or like pick the things that you think they'll benefit most
in
from?
the present levels part, you can list the results. I mean, you can list their strengths and their weaknesses. But then when you move on into the IP document, and I can pull one up here in a minute. I have a practice one. You actually you pull just the weaknesses you think are the most important and are aligned more with where they are,
Okay.
and maybe align with the same grade level standards or whatever. You know, you kind of have to align some of it.
Yeah.
And then that goes in another part, and it's under what they call findings, and that's where you would put your baseline.
Gotcha.
And that's where, even though all that stuff's mentioned here, but then it gets more specific in the findings. And when somebody outside reads those findings, they're going to then look for an annual goal.
Okay, that makes sense.
Does that make sense?
So, Ms. Spagnotta,
The whole thing needs to flow,
Mhm.
and that's where we all get excited all the time.
so when they're setting up their goals, their annual goals, do you all tell them don't have more than 3 goals or 5 goals? Or
I personally do not tell them that. Some, at one point, when typically you wrote goals and objectives, when teachers, even in support service or resource, wrote goals and objectives, then we said for every goal there had to be a minimum of 2 objectives. But then several years ago, it went to what they call goals only, except for those students that are lower functioning and are on alternate curriculum and alternate assessment. They still have to have a goal with objectives. And I felt like when it went that way, that I really felt like we should be seeing more goals. Because almost like the objective became an annual goal. And because you do all the progress monitoring and all that, and I would see more goals. But I'm going to tell you the standard of a teacher's thinking, a experienced teacher, they're going to write, if they have a reading weakness and a math weakness, they're going to write 1 goal for each.
Yeah, and that's really troublesome to me because reading encompasses so many different things, and most.
And they try to cram all those things in one paragraph, in one goal.
And then how are they going to measure that, right?
Yeah, that was like what my question was. Like,
Yeah.
how do you know how long or short to go?
I don't think each goal has to be long. You have to have something to measure it with.
Right.
and it has to be specific, but I think you could have more goals. Because if you make it too long and bulky, it's easy to lose sight of what you're trying to
Exactly.
accomplish.
And you
it
have to
just
do all
sets you up
that
for
progress
failure.
monitoring on
For
every
every
component
single-
in there,
yeah.
and you have to. I just think it makes it more difficult to assess progress.
Mm-hmm.
I would be more of the, if it was determining the main idea, I would do that as one goal. If it's being able to put the information in a certain order, the way it should go, I would maybe do that. If it's decoding or, just reading comprehension, answering questions, who, what, when, where, why, those kind of things. I think that I would write my IEPs where it was more divided and I had more reading goals and more math goals. Just because I would feel like it would make it easier for me
Right.
to monitor.
Mm-hmm.
But you will see, and you'll find that experienced teachers were so used to writing a reading goal and a math goal. And then they had objectives that did that other stuff. See, so the goal wouldn't be so long. But when they went to goals only, they didn't change that. And I've never, some people do it and some people don't. And you'll know what your student needs.
Right.
But just like that, what I was going to say, they're all different. So every IEP right there in that stack would be totally different, basically. And it should be. There'll be some things that are same because everybody takes standardized tests, and you have to figure out how they take them. But their accommodations will be different. Some students might have modifications, and the services you give them are different. And even when they're planning and you're encouraging them to plan for life after school, it's going to be a different plan for everybody. When she said she was going to make that, I said, "Oh, that's perfect."
That is perfect.
It was all right.
So cute.
Yeah. Let me keep going. Now, I gave y'all an indicator 13, and I know she said this morning. I don't know if y'all have gone over there yet or not. This indicator 13 came from the National Transition Alliance people, and lots of states, including at one point, we actually used it for monitoring our transition and IEPs. Now it's just a good all-around kind of checklist. The first 3 pages are their directions, and you're going to see at the top there, it was out of, I believe it was out of North Carolina, so they must not have a law that's any more stringent. It says 16 at the top. That's because that was based on the federal law. You would just need to make sure it was 13 in your mind. But if you can, we have to have for transition in the state of South Carolina 100% compliance. There's no 98, there's no 99. It has to be 100%. Our State Department decided that's what they would tell the feds we were going to do, so we're going to be 100%. So when they monitor us, it's hard. Very seldom do you ever get 100% the first time. You have to make some corrections. But if you'll write your IEPs, if you'll take this, kind of have it beside you when you're writing a transition IEP, and think how it's written, these questions, and ask yourself these questions. And if you can say yes to all of them, the only one you have an exception on is maybe sometimes an outside agency does not have to be invited. So that could be an NA, and that does not count as a no. And if you can, with everything, your knowledge, and applying your knowledge, if you can answer yes to what you put in that IEP, to all these questions, then you should have a compliant transition IEP.
That's nice.
I love this.
I printed these directions because I felt like our state had some, at one point, just a little small sheet. And for a while, all our state handed out was this. But then I noticed that they've now put these directions that came with the form from, I don't think it was Appalachian, but it was a college in North Carolina. And they really did a lot of research, and they do a lot of research. And anyway, I feel like these directions are real user-friendly, and we'll get to that. But if that was the thing with the indicator 13, it pretty much aligns with your federal law. So this has got on a simple questionnaire the components you would need to have in your transition IEP. There's just such an interrelationship between academics and planning for life after school and preparing our students for the future. And I feel like that if you'll start writing your transition IEP, just begin with, just think about the future in the end. And then we'll just take steps back. So if this kid is earning a state high school diploma and really into engineering, then they're probably going to need to go to college, a 4-year college. So what's it going to take to get this kid from right here in 9th grade to a 4-year college that offers like engineering? And sometimes you might be working on a different path every year.
Yeah, I was gonna ask that.
Because they change their minds. And that's okay too. Usually the grades, the middle school grades, I have 13-year-olds in 6th grade, and our middle schools are just 7th and 8th grade in Florence. And so I deal with some elementary schools too that have a 6th grade at their school. And that's a little bit, they're just kind of, that's a hard age. They're just kind of floating around.
Right.
All their hormones are kicking in, and they're just kind of, so you kind of really have to get them to focus and start thinking about the interests. But I feel like skills that they need to be learning early on is, what is my IEP? Why am I in your class?
Right.
Why, I know that I can come take my test with you if I need to, or I know that you come pull me out of a class. I know that I have this on my schedule, and we do all this bell work and stuff in here. It's just, why am I here, and what is my disability, and what does that mean?
Right. That's
What kind of accommodations do I need? And just getting comfortable with the IEP process. And understanding different disabilities mean different things. And I have, even for a student with learning disabilities, one student might be an auditory learner, and somebody else might not be. So somebody that can't do the visual stuff might need to hear it. And so they're going to be a little bit different from this student over here who's just the opposite. And so the accommodations should look different. And as much as possible, if you can get your students included. And I can't tell you that were y'all all in here this morning? Were you in here this morning? Okay. The dean said when you're going out and applying and interviewing, finding out what your administration at the school, how they kind of feel about special ed. And so asking questions that would say, okay, if you're talking about co-teaching, what kind of co-teaching you're talking about? Are you talking about with me and another special ed teacher, or are you talking about with me and a regular ed teacher, or how does that work in your school? Or how does self-contained work in your school, or who is, so those were very good questions, because it will get, we still have administrators out there that do shove all their special ed kids in the back. Now Florence one has a high rate of pass difficulties. And one at one time was a middle school, and they had all their special ed self-contained kids back on one wing with no regular ed classes or anything. And they pretty much, it was an ID mod classes and some severe orthopedic students that were in self-contained. And they were just all in one wing, and they had access to a kitchen. And, it was not on purpose. It just was what it was. But it took one parent to come through and say, where are the non-disabled? When do they get with non-disabled people, non-disabled peers? So then they had to revamp everything and they put a couple of regular ed classes back there. And not to say that the philosophy has changed, not sure, I think probably because because administration has changed through the years, then yes, the philosophy's changed, and the students are more included. But you got to understand that was 20 years ago, at least. I started there in 93, 94, and I think it might have happened in 94, 95. And so that's been a long time. And but it's better. I mean, originally, Florence School District 1 had a red brick school. They called it the red brick school. And that's where all the self-contained students went. Well, then they got in, and I mean, but it's just history of special ed. And it's everywhere. It's not just, and so every district does something a little bit different. And they're able, as long as they stay within the law, they're able to be flexible. And you've got some building principals that are really going to go gung-ho and include everybody and everything. And you still have some principals probably with some mindsets that don't do that as much. So I was impressed with him saying that this morning, because really that is will put you in a situation, if you have somebody that is really has bought into working with students with disabilities, then you'll have a much happier experience. And so that was I felt like that really touched me. I don't know why, but that really stuck with me this morning. Like I said, an IEP becomes a transition IEP, and that's when the services within the IEP are based upon students' documented disability, including accommodations, modifications, and service needs. Their career and post-school interests and preferences, and their post-school considerations. And the way it's written actually in the Enrich program, which one thing, if you'll also start with the mindset of special ed can change it at any second, any minute. A new regulation could be, a new court case could affect all the regulations. And they're driven a lot by the court cases and the results of court cases. So you have to be flexible. It's not going to be the same way all the time. But you know that because your students aren't the same.
Right.
It's a conglomeration. And the elements of transition-rich IEPs, first and foremost, is student-focused. Where's the student at, and where do they need to be, and and how can I help them get there? And with the post-school, and you do this through their present levels, doing appropriate assessments. All their assessments and the whole IEP becomes a transition IEP. If you think like that, when they turn 13 during the life of it, if you'll think that the whole IEP then is becoming a transition IEP. So not only are we going to be dealing with academics, we're going to be dealing with making plans for the future and getting our students prepared. Now, I find sometimes that we tend to enable our students because sometimes it's easier, and after having K through 12 of somebody where they know they can go to them and take their test or whatever, what you have to prepare them for at this level, though, is they're going to have to do all that stuff on their own and go to somebody and say, hey, I have a disability. I'm going to need some accommodations. Without their mommy resource teacher or their mommy teacher. Because you really do become their moms away from home, and sometimes you're the only mom they have. And so you think about it when you're raising your kids, you want them to be able to go to college and move off and be independent and to do things on their own. That's what you're constantly preparing your children to do. Or it might be a younger sister, helping them become more independent. But that's what we also want to do with our students with these transition IEPs. And to me, that's the primary focus, is you're doing your academics and addressing these academic weaknesses, but we can't let them fall through the cracks later. And actually, the South Carolina State Profile of a Graduate has listed skills. When they say the profile of somebody that's graduating high school, it has certain skills they have listed. and one of them is self-determination skills. And I've never seen that word before until I tried to find that slide. They had a PowerPoint, and I couldn't find it. I haven't, and I forgot to put it in. But that's where we're going with this. And so when they start with their transition IEPs, number one, you're required by law to invite them and to show documentation where you did invite them to the meeting. And on the response page. And then as they get older, at 18, actually, all of their rights under the IEP and all of their rights roll over to them. They're like you send the invitation letter to them. And then in Florence 1, we address it like this. Unless there's some kind of court documentation, now that's a statewide thing. Unless there's some kind of court documentation that says the parent still is the guardian and they are responsible for, because you have some students with some really severe disabilities that unless they've gone through and gotten a power of attorney and gone through the courts and got something written up, then the student is in charge of their IEP and their education when they turn 18. And it automatically rolls over when they turn 18. Just like when you turned 18, you became a legal adult. And I can't come up here. Now, I could probably come here easier than I could go somewhere like Clemson and pick up the phone and say, look here, I'm worried about Adriana. I don't think she's doing her grade. Her grades are good, or is something going on, or because Clemson would go, click. Carolina would click because you're not, unless you come up there with some kind of paperwork that says, yeah, they're going to hang up on the parent.
We have to do that here too.
Yeah, I worked for Chapel, and parents would call and say, how many Chapel credits does my student have? Yeah. They would ask to make sure their child's going every week. And we would say, sorry, we can't tell you.
You really can't.
Yeah.
You can't.
I work at financial aid, and that's all I do.
Yeah, legally you can't. Yes. So then I have to just stay on Adriana. Call the financial aid office. Have you called the financial aid office?
How would that do?
But see, and I've been blessed because I have a child that is going to be letting me know. You know?
Right.
But I have to have her call, and I know I drive her crazy doing it.
I have a question.
But that's it. I mean, it's the law. I know I drive you crazy. You have a question.
I do. Okay, so I know students, special ed students that are like more severe, end up staying in high school until they're 21 sometimes.
Yes.
Like my cousin did that. So do they continue to have an IP, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And so the transition, so say before, like it's their senior year, like and they're 18 years old. Does the transition goal say that their goal is to still stay in high school until they're 21? Or like
No, because you're unless it's some kind of annual goal, but I wouldn't know. I would say no. You still are planning for whenever they exit school, whether they're exiting at
So you don't
18
even, like, look at
or
that.
exiting at 21.
So like,
Yeah,
it's
they
not
kinda
even
look at it.
benchmark at all.
Some
And,
exit at 17.
Actually, some students, when they're 18, if they're not earning a state high school diploma, can walk across the stage with their class and get their attendance or certificate or credential. Employee, it depends on what kind of program they're in, and then come back the next
what
year
my
until
cousin
they're
did.
21.
Yeah.
And
So they continue to still have an IEP.
yes, in
Throughout.
fact, by law, at that time, if they have not earned a state high school diploma and are not going to graduate with a state high school diploma, but they're 18 and they're going to walk across the stage, we still have to prepare an IEP for the following year because they're still eligible for
Services.
special ed services.
And that 21 cutoff, does that mean like as soon as they turn 21, like even in the middle of the year they're not allowed?
No.
Like,
It if you are in our district, and they leave it up to some districts, but the typical date for birthdays and grades and is September 1st. Yeah. So if they are not 21 before September 1st.
Okay.
Even if it's September 2nd when they turn 21, they can go that whole year.
Got it. Okay.
But you would have to check with your districts because some districts say before the first day of school. And they have that right to put in their procedures, however.
So they could
that
go to another district though potentially and do another year.
they could.
Yeah.
And some people say through the entire 21st year until they turn 22.
Right.
So even if they're, some districts might say they might be 21 on September 1st, but then turn 22 in December, and they'll get to come that year too. But now Florence 1 does not. Florence 1 is if you are 21 before September 1st or on September 1st, then right.
I never thought about that until
Because I think somewhere around Winthrop, they may do through with the 22 thing. It was a big confusion there for a little while. But we are obligated because they're still eligible for services to write an IEP for that following school year. Now, if they're going to exit, and we know they're going to exit through transition, we're also required to write a summary of performance when they're exiting school or say they're graduating. So some years like that, you might be writing a summary of performance and a new IEP because they'll say that they're not coming back. Some students will say, I'm not coming back. Once I go across it, I am not coming back. And come fall, when they've sat at home all summer and done nothing, or they're missing all their friends and everybody else that's going back to school, they'll come back. So you already have an IEP ready for them. But once they turn that 21 when they leave, you just write the summary performance, and there's actually, you have to attach a different letter saying that now they're no longer eligible for special ed services. So they can't come back. But see, you might be planning for somebody in that situation that might be going into a work training center with voc rehab or disabilities and special needs board. So all of those things are you transition plan for any student with a disability that's serving by an IEP. So when your plans are just so different, you might have somebody that only qualifies for special ed through speech and language because that's a separate category, and they may not need anything hardly, but you still have to. Those pathologists can't stand me because you still have to address it in the IEP. Transition services is a mandated service. It is not like occupational therapy or physical therapy. It's not like transportation. It's not like counseling that they get through a counselor in the school. It is a mandated service and takes up a good portion of the IEP. So you have to, and y'all, I'm so funny.
like so much.
It's 2:21.
I know.
I seriously already feel like I learned so much. My brain is like.
All right, well, the main thing, if you find the slides that say under each section, guiding questions, so when you're thinking about writing an IEP, look for those guiding questions. And I told her earlier, I put some websites in here. This is a committee in South Carolina that gives lots of good special ed teacher resources for transition stuff. It's our Transition Alliance of South Carolina. And they put on the transition conferences, and they're through the disabilities or something through USC, but it's a grant. And they have people for every area. And we have lots of interagency teams now. Like we have a team in our district that's got somebody from DDSN, somebody from voc rehab, and other local agencies that might be providing services to our kids. So we can kind of plan. The State Department of Ed, I think that was before, yeah. Actually, they have on there, they have an Indicator 13 module that you might want to do one day. And it's a video and then has activities that go with it. I think I brought a copy of that. I'll leave that with you.
That should
That's
just
where
flip
it looks
something.
like this. And it's actually a module that will play and you listen, and there's a little sheet that they can take notes that they already have a fill in the blank to take notes. And then at the end, you can take a test and see if you pass. And it's neat. And they have one for the prior written notice too, because I find the prior written notices are never written.
Oh, I was gonna ask what that is at some point because the special ed teachers at my school always talk about it. I'm like, I don't know what that means. What is
Oh, have y'all?
Prior written
Yeah.
notice?
And they have a module on this. It's all under the oversight and assistance. I think is what it's called. On the you go to instruction and then special services and oversight and assistance. And they have a prior written notice module that's just designed kind of like this. And then they have the Indicator 13 module. And they have good teacher resources for assessment and everything on there. The one thing I want to charge you with, I didn't get to near anything, y'all. I'm sorry.
You can come back.
Seriously.
Is this right here? In there, I put a chart, and the kids, they don't want to go to their meetings and talk. But if we prepare them to do that, and they're comfortable with themselves, they will. And move from a teacher-directed IEP meeting to a student-directed IEP meeting. And our goal is in 1819 in Florence to do that for all juniors and seniors, and then move down to the sophomores and freshmen, so that all our high school students will be leading their own annual review meetings. And if they're not comfortable doing that, use things like this that describe them that they can do. And it opens up the meeting with their description of themselves, because it's an opportunity for them to connect with all the members.
Yeah.
Instead of having people sit around and talk about them.
Yeah.
I know, I gotta go. Bye.
Thank you so
But I'm
much.
sorry. Any questions though, she can get me. And my email's on there.
Okay.
And I have lots of assessment resources and IEP resources. So,
I love this. Seriously.
well,